Hey, buenos días, Pastor Junior. So yeah, I'm walking my dog. But no, I'm not. I'm just a grandpa. No, but anyways, I wanted to share this message with you guys because I sent out a devotion earlier, right? And it's based on Luke chapter 15, right? Luke chapter 15 is based on the prodigal son. Well, right, the statement goes like this. It says, while the son was still running, God was still what? Working. Right? Ahí te va otra vez. It says, while the son was still running, God was still working. Right? And, you know, some of you guys might have a prodigal son out there. You know, homeboy left the pad or homegirl left the pad. Right? Because it might be a daughter, might be a son. Pero mira, Luke 15, right? You guys can read it in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32 is where it ends. But it begins with Luke chapter 11. Jesus gave the story. He says, while the son was still running, God was still working, right? Y luego, while the father was still waiting, God was still moving, right? Otra vez, it says, while the father was still waiting, God was still moving, right? And what changed? Right? What changed right there? Well, God reached a heart that nobody else could reach, right? Otra vez, it says, but changed? Well, God reached a heart that nobody else could reach, right? So don't let what you see today convince you that nothing is happening, right? Otra vez. So don't let what you see today, right? Don't let what you see today convince you that nothing is happening, right? So, what changed? Well, what changed? Right? So, what changed is the question. Ahí te va otra vez. Well, God reached a heart that nobody else could change. That nobody else could reach. And I'm trying to walk the dog. He wants to take off. Pero, bueno, se llama Bane. Right? Pero once again, it says, once again, the message. You know, I was looking at verse 17 of Luke 15. It says, but while he came to himself, right? I think the NIV says, while he came to his senses, right? But ahí está otra vez, Luke 15:17. It says, but while he came to himself or to his senses, y luego verse 18 dice, I will arise. He says, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, right? And I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. Right? Notice what it says. Verse 17. ¿Qué dice? Verse 17, ¿qué dice? But while he came to himself, right? You know, like I said, I think the NIV says to his senses, right? But while he came to himself, came to his senses, lower verse 18 says, I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, right? He sinned against God, and he sinned and against you, or before you. He said the New King James. I sinned against heaven, or I sinned against you. You know, and so what did he sin? What was his sin? Right? Because he said he sinned against heaven. Well, he sinned against heaven because rejecting the Father's authority, right? He sinned against God. He sinned against heaven because rejecting the Father's authority turned his back on his home. Represented a spiritual departure from God, right? So ahí te va otra vez. I sinned against heaven, the prodigal son says, right? Because he rejected his father's authority and turned his back on his home, right? Representing a spiritual departure from God. And and then he said, against you, right? And against you, he tells his father. Why? Because demanding his inheritance early, by demanding his inheritance early, he was wishing his father dead. and which was a problem, which was a profound insult in that culture. So in that culture, asking for your inheritance early from your parents meant that you wish your parents dead. I don't know if that might be a message for one of you guys. Right? You guys got a lot of wealth in there. Pero, once again, he said against heaven and I sinned against you. So first he recognized that he sinned against God. Then he recognizes he sinned against his father. Right? And why? Because requesting his inheritance early meant that he wished his father dead, which was a what? Which was a profound insult in that culture. Amen? Orale, just wanted to encourage you guys with that. God bless.